There's people entrenched at the top and take it. But Hooker is willing to give it a shot. He's up to the task. Hooker was a terrible army commander, but he's good at the corps level. Sherman's army, meanwhile, is assigned the task of attacking Bragg's right flank. Okay, and again, this is they're at the northern edge of Missionary Ridge. The mountain, the lookout mountain that I mentioned, that's the Confederate right. General Thomas is going to demonstrate against the Confederate center, and we talked earlier about what a demonstration is. It's just you fire some cannon, you move guys up, you fire some bullets in, but you don't really make a full-fledged attack. You're not trying to take ground. You're just trying to keep them busy so that the center cannot shift guys to the left and right. They're also on Missionary Ridge. Thomas's soldiers, though, were offended. They said, "What do you mean demonstrate? This seems like a secondary assignment." They had a chip on their shoulder. They were still mad about Chickamauga, where they had stood their ground even as the other Union troops were leaving, and then they were forced to retreat pretty much because of the retreat of the rest of the army. So they're going to have a different idea of what to do. We'll see that in a minute. So on November 24th, believe it or not, Hooker's men actually do capture Lookout Mountain. And this is an interesting battle because the clouds on that day were hanging pretty low. So the fight was later called the Battle Above the Clouds. They were up so high that they were actually in the clouds and even above them to some degree. The following morning, some Union soldiers place a flag at the top of the hill, and that is a huge morale booster for the rest of the Union Army, which is down on the ground. Union soldiers on the ground, they break out into cheers. It's not quite like Iwo Jima and Mount Suribachi, but hey, it's a great development. They just took a mountain, for crying out loud. That's pretty darn good. So good for Fighting Joe. On the other side, believe it or not, Sherman, who is no slouch, of course, he has a little bit less success. He has to fight the best Confederate division. It was under a man named Patrick Cleburne. Cleburne was an Irish immigrant who ended up in the South and in the Confederate Army. He pushes back Sherman's troops, the Bluecoats. And then the next morning, this is the 25th, then November 25th, one of Sherman's subordinate generals, Phil Sheridan, he's going to have a big future. We'll be talking about him quite a bit in the future. Sheridan, he takes out a flask and he raises it to the Confederate gunners at the top of the ridge, and he says, here's at you. So he's kind of mocking them, like, we're coming after you. So he does this mock toast to the Confederate defenders. And the Confederates, they're not real thrilled with this. They fire a cannon at him in response. They miss, fortunately for the Union, but they splatter him with mud. So he gets his uniform dirty. Sheridan replies, "That was ungenerous. I'll take your guns for that."
Add that to the Civil War Book of Quips. We're just filling it up.
We are. There's a lot of good quotes. Sherman has most of them, but Sheridan gets this one. Sheridan has a great, great quote, but we're going to save it for kind of our epilogue episode that we're going to do after the battles are all over. All right, Grant orders Thomas to attack the line of trenches at the base of Lookout Mountain. Remember, I'm sorry, this is Missionary. This is Missionary Ridge. I'm sorry, I think I put the wrong thing down in the notes. But anyway, the point is, don't go up the ridge. Don't attack up there. Just attack the first line of trenches at the bottom. Do not go any further. And Thomas says, "Okay, I got it. I won't go any further." But he's back with Grant. He entrusts the actual attack to his subordinates. So Grant is standing there with Thomas watching what happens, and they're watching. They're way back from the front. And to their surprise, Thomas's men do not stop at the rifle pits at the base of the ridge. They march all the way to the top. They just go up and up and up and up, and they keep going. They pass the middle group of rifle pits and drive those defenders back, and then they make it all the way to the top, and they capture it. And these men, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, finish that.
Oh, well, yeah. Grant leans over to Thomas, and he says, "Who ordered those men up the hill?" And Thomas says, "I don't know. I did not." And then he says, "When those fellows get started, all hell can't stop them." Grant says, "Yeah, someone's going to catch hell if this turns out badly."
Hey everyone, want to take a short break in this episode on our narrative on the Civil War and ask you a quick pop quiz about medical care at this time period, and it has to do with dentistry. In the mid-19th century, if you needed a tooth pulled, Who would be doing the pulling? Would it be A, a general store clerk, B, a blacksmith, C, a barber, or D, any of the above? Before I get the answer, I want to mention a product that has to do with this pop quiz, and it's a company called Candid. Here's what it does. Candid basically takes all of the misery out of adult orthodontia. There's millions of people at any given time in the United States who have wire braces, and there are many, many millions more who should be wearing retainers and aren't and need a tooth straightening solution. Well, Candid is a company that makes it possible to get tooth straightening without ever having to visit an orthodontist, without ever having to leave your home, and to get it all done much more cheaply and in a fraction of the time of conventional orthodontia. The way it works is that Candid sends a modeling kit to your home so you can take impressions of your teeth. After you send back your impressions with some photos of your teeth, a network of orthodontists reviews your case and provides you with a 3D preview of what your treatment will look like. After you receive your 3D preview, it's up to you if you want to go forward or not with a tooth aligner treatment plan. And when you get your treatment plan, it results in straighter and brighter teeth in an average of 6 months and can cost thousands of dollars less than braces. And again, no office visits are needed. Everything is delivered to your home. You can take advantage of Candid's risk-free modeling kit guarantee, and when you use my dedicated link, candidcode.com/unplugged, you'll save 25% off your modeling kit. That's candidcode.com/unplugged to get 25% off the price of your modeling kit. candidcode.com/unplugged. And lastly, what's the answer to the pop quiz about who pulled teeth in the 19th century? The answer is D, any of the above. It could be a general store clerk, a blacksmith, or a barber. And I mean, just to give a sense of what it's like to capture this hill, I have a quote here from a Union infantryman who described it later. His name was Fred Neffler of the 79th, Indiana, and he describes it like this. Nothing could live in or about the captured line of field works. A few minutes of such terrific, telling fire would quickly convert them into untenable, hideous slaughter pens. There was no time or opportunity for deliberations. Something must be done, and it must be done quickly. So maybe that situation that they were in, where they go to the top of the ridge, maybe they thought that, well, our options are retreat, die, or continue the assault. So they just scramble right up the hill. That might be the situation there.
Yeah, I mean, they were mad. They had something to prove after Chickamauga. I think they had a chip on their shoulders, as I said earlier. So, and this is interesting because the rebels retreat. The Federals get all the way to the top. They take the ridge. And this is an exception to the usual rule. Now, a good listener who's been with us all along will remember that we keep saying, Scott and I keep saying, you know, we're experts on Civil War combat, right, Scott?
Absolutely, yes.
We've been in it, you know, we're 200 years old, but when we were in there, when we were generals in the Union Army, no, just kidding. But we have said again and again that you cannot do a frontal assault. Every time we've seen this, every time that an army just marches straight forward, crash head on, smash into the position, and the defender is usually dug in behind a wall or behind pits or earthworks or something, you get killed. Frontal assaults are insane, but here is an exception to that rule. Isn't that interesting, Scott?
Yeah.
Every rule this is the exception that proves the rule. I mean, the fact that we're talking about this and saying, look, it worked. They marched right up through 3 lines of rifle pits, and they're going up a ridge. It's almost like Pickett's charge. It's almost like Fredericksburg. But this time the Confederates just completely collapse. It's a very interesting situation.
Yeah, it's interesting. And the situation was unique, and there could be a few different reasons. One, like you mentioned, is that, first of all, the Confederates were more depleted than normal, which really says something. So Longstreet's 15,000 troops are sent away. Confederates have to work harder to defend their flanks, and Bragg doesn't have the numbers to withstand the assault at the center. Another factor, something I read, is where the Confederates placed their artillery. Instead of at the crest of the ridge, they're at the geologic, so kind of the center of the ridge. So most of the guns are too far back from the slope to fire at the troops quickly heading their way up. And then another factor is that the placement of a number of Confederate troops in indefensible positions at the base on the side of the ridge. They'd be compelled to retreat if they survived the initial assault. And so this makes it harder for them to solidify their forces. But so what happens when the Confederates are retreating?
Well, when they're retreating, the Federal soldiers taunt them. They shout, "Chickamauga, Chickamauga," as if to say, well, okay, what do you think now? What do you think about, how's Chickamauga working for you right now? So they're just letting them know that, yes, we remember that you just beat us, but now we're beating you. And here's a little piece of trivia, a little fun fact here I want to throw in. One of the Union color bearers in the charge up Missionary Ridge was a young officer named Arthur MacArthur. Arthur MacArthur, later after the Civil War, he goes on to become a general in the Philippines. He fights in the Spanish-American War, and his son becomes even more famous. Perhaps a few of our listeners have heard of him, Douglas MacArthur. He's going to have a huge future too. But I just thought that was interesting that the father of Douglas MacArthur, who himself was later a general in his own right, was a young lieutenant or captain at this time and was involved in this Battle of Chattanooga.
I saw that, and for a second I had to realize that he was the father and not Douglas MacArthur himself. I thought, wait, a 110-year-old man is a general in World War II? Yeah. How does this work out?
MacArthur never died.
Yeah, well, he's a vampire.
Soldiers never die. They just fade away, right? So anyway, it's a complete disaster for the Confederacy, complete Union victory. The entire Confederate Army retreats 25 miles to Dalton, Georgia. And a funny little quote here. Years later, when a student of the battle commented to Grant that the Confederate generals saw their position as impregnable, Grant says, well, it was impregnable. And yet they got it anyway. I think leadership is very important, too, in this role, on this battle, Scott. We've been talking about Bragg and how ineffective he could not inspire people. He was just this grouchy guy. He hated everybody. Everybody hated him. His generals couldn't get along. They didn't like each other. They didn't like him. And, you look on the Union side and you've got Grant, who is also very good at dealing with difficult people. You've got Sherman, you've got Sheridan, you've got George Thomas, you've got Joe Hooker. Again, he's very good at lower levels, not a good Army commander. So I think the talent balance is beginning to shift into the favor of the Union. We talked about this very early on, that it seemed like early in the war, most of the great command talent, if you will, was on the Confederate side. But we're starting to see, we've seen that a lot of these guys are dying off. Stonewall Jackson was killed. Albert Sidney Johnson was killed very early on. And they're just not raising up new guys to replace them. You're getting guys like Bragg, and you're getting guys like Polk and people like that. We talked about Pemberton at Vicksburg, people like that. Whereas the junior officers, the colonels and the brigadier generals that are coming up and becoming big Union commanders are your Thomases and your Shermans and your Sheridans and people like that. So it's a very interesting situation. But again, I think leadership is beginning to go over into the Union column as a major advantage.
Yeah, and I think another factor is the managing of morale, which we see it's almost like there's a turning point that happens within these battles when Union morale is rallied. And here's an example of how Grant handles that morale. After these victories in eastern Tennessee, Grant issues a congratulatory order to his troops on December 10th, and here's what he says to continue to massage the morale. In a short time, you have recovered from the enemy the control of the Tennessee River from Bridgeport to Knoxville. You dislodged him from Chattanooga Valley, wrested from his determined grasp the possession of the Missionary Ridge, repelled with heavy loss to him his repeated assaults upon all points, utterly routed and discomfited beyond the limits of the state. By your noble heroism and determined courage, you have most effectually defeated the plans of the enemy for regaining possession of the states of Kentucky and Tennessee. You have secured positions from which no rebellious power can drive or dislodge you. And then on the Confederate side, in Georgia, there's a retreating Confederate officer that observes, "Captain, this is the death knell of the Confederacy. We cannot cope with those fellows with the advantages we had on this line. There's not a line between here and the Atlantic Ocean where we can stop them." And his captain responded, "Hush, Lieutenant. This is treason. you are talking. Da-da-da. Ominous words, but before we read too much into things, let's look at the number